So I hope this morning that we realize how utterly crazy we sound. I mean, here we are saying that this Jewish wannabe rabbi 2,000 years ago who got killed because he got crosswise with the religious leaders and the Roman authorities, at least to some extent, is risen from the dead. Now that is a weird sounding claim. To say he is risen, well, that takes a real suspension of our logic, doesn't it? Anyone else know anyone that's risen? Ever experienced that? Anybody else come back from the dead in that same sort of manner? We're alleging that this is the only time this has ever happened in history, and yet we're totally committed to the idea that this is true, right? You see how crazy we sound? Utterly absurd. How can we believe such things? What does it even mean to believe such things? You know, it's always sounded absurd. Some people today will be talking, kind of in my role, be trying to convince people that this is very plausible, that they want to prove it. They want to make it easier to believe the absolutely outrageous. I think that's the wrong approach. As I wrote in my little email teaser on Friday, unless we disbelieve the resurrection, we won't ever believe it well. And so let's be honest about it, that this sounds utterly crazy. And what does it even mean to believe in something that you can't even logically say makes any sense? Well, it never has. We have some evidence about the early church, not from the mouths of any Christians, because those are going to be suspect, right? I mean, if they're part of the group, how can you believe their testimony? They've already, as it were, jumped into this thing and believe it. There's a lot of people who believe the earth is flat. If you listen to them, they're absolutely convinced of it. I, on the other hand, think they're incorrect. But we have some very early evidence. There was a Roman governor in present-day Turkey who wasn't sure what to do with these Christians, and so he wrote letters to the Emperor Trajan to say, what in the world do you want me to do with this odd little group of people? His name was Pliny the Younger. The dates of his letter is about 112 A.D. So we're talking, 70, 80 years after Jesus' death. Here's what he writes to the Emperor Trajan. And so this is not Christian testimony. This is this guy saying, what in the heck do I do with these people? He says, speaking of what the Christians have told him as he's tried to find out what are you up to, he said, they asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error, because they've been accused by the Romans of being at fault, he says, they're saying the sum of their and substance of their fault or error has been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath not to some crime. It's not that they were plotting to do something evil. This is what he's saying to the emperor. They bound themselves to an oath not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not to falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. Even this they affirmed they had ceased to do after my edict, by which, in accordance with your instructions, I had forbidden political associations. Accordingly, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. But I discovered nothing else but depraved, excessive superstition. See, he had listened to what they said. He thought there's got to be more going on here with their subversive group. So he takes 2 women who are slaves, who are deaconesses in this movement. That tells you something about what the movement was about, right? Women holding positions, women being recognized, and slave women. He tortures them, and all he finds out to get the truth is more crazy superstitions. They're worshiping this guy that we executed as Romans years ago. They think he's a god. How absurd. How weird. What do I do with this group? See, it's always been a crazy idea, and it's completely unprovable. I won't make any attempt to prove anything about Jesus being raised. In fact, I think that would be not a good thing. Because if we're reading the Gospels, what we see in verse 11 is exactly what I'm talking about. When the women come back from the tomb, in verse 11, it says, they come to the apostles, they tell them what they've seen, these angels, and what the angels said. It says, but these words appeared to them as nonsense, and they would not believe them. So the apostles heard this first testimony about, hey, the body's not there. We saw some angels. They're saying he's risen. And the apostles reacted with, that's nonsense. We don't believe that. See, that's why I'm encouraging us to face boldly the fact that this is unbelievable. Because it is. There's not one of the apostles who believed in the resurrection because someone told them. They all disbelieved. We give Thomas a hard time. We call him Doubting Thomas. Look, he just did what every single other apostle did, which was to say, I'm not going to believe this. I just don't believe it. It's too crazy. It's too absurd. It's too ridiculous. So what do we see in the text? In the very next story, there's a couple disciples that very day on their way to Emmaus. They start a conversation with another traveler. They have this long conversation. They finally get to a stopping place for the evening. And this stranger breaks bread, and all of a sudden they get this impression that this stranger was actually the risen Christ. You know what they do is they run all the way back to Jerusalem and tell the disciples, and guess what kind of reception they get? No. Nobody believes them. See, what happens in the Gospels is nobody proves to someone else that Christ is risen. But what we see is people have encounters with the risen Christ, even though that is completely irrational, makes no sense. They can't say, oh yeah, this is reasonable, and yet they have an encounter in some way with the risen Christ, and that makes a big difference. That changes their lives. See, it still remains on one level absolutely unbelievable. And yet, an experience with the risen Christ changes things. Now, you might be wondering, well, what kind of encounter are you talking about, Greg? And I'm going to suggest to you that there are countless ways to encounter the risen Christ. Not that someone can prove it to you, not that someone can, give you evidence for why you ought to believe that the tomb is empty, but because of something that happens in your life. And it doesn't have to be extraordinary. You don't have to be Paul on the road to Damascus to be physically blind so that suddenly you can see. Your eyes can be opened because your physical eyes are closed for a time. It doesn't have to be that dramatic. Many of us have truly encountered Christ through and in the presence of other people in our lives. No, it wasn't some sort of kind of miraculous, out-of-the-world experience, some kind of vision of angels or something. There was just someone in our life who we were impressed with the way they loved, the kind of people that they were. And we were drawn to that. And somehow we thought, this person I mean, just makes a difference in my life. And we wouldn't point to any sort of miracle, but I think we would say, I felt moved, impressed, drawn to the way they live, the way they approach life. And I would call that an encounter with the risen Christ through your neighbor, through the person next to you. You know, some of us have encountered the risen Christ perhaps in nature, you know, in some different instance where we just suddenly felt moved. And what I mean by the risen Christ is I mean an impression, a sense that there is something more than the merely physical. Then there is something more than just what I can see and I can touch. But I'm kind of stirred by an irresistible and undeniable impression that there is just more to this world than we can lay our hands on. And I experienced that perhaps in and through another person, or in a moment in nature, and all of a sudden I felt something rather transcendent that somehow rose above the ordinary. It wasn't just the natural scene. I was looking at the trees, the flowers, the mountains, or anything, but all of a sudden I felt, well, a sense of something beyond all of that, somehow in all of that, but beyond it. All the encounters with Christ do not have to be, as it were, miraculous. They can be quite ordinary. But there can be that sense in which I start seeking after life. The reason I called my thoughts this morning Seeking After Life, it comes from the two angels in verse 5 who tell the women, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" And I think that's kind of an essential question for us. Because we ask ourselves, well, how am I going to live life? What is it I'm going to aspire to? And there's a lot of dead options, right? I'm speaking metaphorically. There's kind of dead-end options. There's things that don't rise very high in terms of meaning or purpose. It's just the drudgery of the ordinary. And sometimes you start wondering, is this all there is? I mean, I go to work, I come home, I mow the yard, I go to work, I come home. Then I'm not so sure I'm going to be able to go to work because there's trouble at work and maybe I'm going to lose my job. You know, it's kind of drudgery. It's kind of dead, right? But the angels raise that question. Why do you seek the living among the dead? I mean, how do I seek a kind of life worth living? Can I find something more transcendent, something that rises above the level of the very mundane that can motivate me, inspire me, and give me the capacity to persevere when the mundane seems overwhelming? That's what I would call having an encounter with Christ. Is something happens in your life that gives you a glimpse and a glimmer of something worth living for, rather than just, is this all that it is, and just continues until I get older and older and at some point die? Or is there something else? And when we have those experiences, I call that an encounter with Christ, with the risen Christ. We may not even know it at the time that it's the risen Christ we encountered. You may look back in your life based on what I'm saying and realize, you know what? I think I've had encounters with the risen Christ and nobody told me that's what it was. But I felt sort of inspired. I felt drawn to something. I felt there's something worth doing even if the world is against it. And that seems to me to be the Spirit of Christ. I can tell you one of the times that this happened for me, I'd finished my freshman year at college. I was a computer science major. Still interested in technology, but I was a computer science major. But my parents were living in Australia, so I couldn't exactly go home during the summer break because I was in school in Tennessee. So I decided to spend the summer working with the church, kind of in a campaign thing. There was this program, and you went to different places, and you did work to help usually kind of struggling churches that were small and needed some college kids to come do some help. And I spent 9 weeks outside of Philadelphia with a little church plant that met in a YMCA. And, I'm just kind of doing this. I think it's important to do this, but I'm just doing this as something to fill my summer, right? That's all I'm doing. I can get back to the fall where I got room and board. At least, see, doing this, I had room and board. I'm staying with people in the church, and they're feeding me, right? Like, I've got somewhere to sleep, and I've got food to eat, and I get to the fall, and I can start a new semester. And so there were 3 of us together for those 9 weeks. We knocked on the door of this lady. Her name was Susan, and she had 3 small children, and the house was virtually empty of furniture because her husband was in jail for turning back odometers at the car dealership. And everything that they had in the house had been on, kind of pay to own, rent to own kind of stuff. And so it had all been repossessed. And she didn't even have a car. She'd grown up in the South. She'd grown up Baptist. She wasn't interested in Jesus. We didn't talk to her about Jesus. But we realized this lady needed some help. She had 3 small kids. So the 3 college students, we spent some time kind of hanging with the kids, babysitting the kids, giving Susan a ride so she could go somewhere and do things and give her a break. And we spent most of that summer with her, just helping out. Not talking about God, not talking about Jesus. At the very end, I remember she asked a little bit and divulged a little bit about her bad experiences with religion. She asked a little bit about, what do you guys think, actually? Well, I went back to college, and I heard a little bit later that both she and her husband had become Christians and joined that small group meeting at the YMCA. So you know what I decided? Change my major. Change my major. I can either spend my life sitting in front of computer screens writing code, and I was pretty good at the time. Not that I could write code today. But I changed my major. Because you know what? I thought this is more meaningful than writing good computer code. Nothing wrong with writing good computer code, but there was something in me that wanted to do something more. And I felt moved by Susan, her children, and their situation. So in some ways, I could say I encountered the risen Lord in a lady named Susan and her 3 children. Not because she was telling me anything, but because in her situation, I found something that tugged at me. This is meaningful. See, that's what I mean by encountering the risen Lord. Something that we might say, well, that's a calling from God. Yes, but those are not nearly as sexy or extraordinary as you might think. They're often just a sense that I can't give this up. And I want to live for this. And even if it doesn't seem to be working out in the world, I still want to live for it anyway. Not because it's going to be successful, but because somehow it just seems to be what's good. And I have a sense of the good. See, I think that's what it means for us to have an encounter with the risen Lord. I think that's what it means for the angels to say, why are you seeking the living among the dead? So where am I focused? I mean, it really doesn't matter what we do for a living, as it were, for a paycheck, or how we seek employment. That's not what it's about. But it's about how, in and through whatever we're doing, we have a sense of calling, a sense of something that transcends the ordinary. So what it comes down to mean is, I have to make sense of what it means to live a human life in this world as it is, on its terms. How do I make sense of that? What account do I give for the human life that I'm going to live? In some ways, the question is not whether Jesus was raised, but will I be raised from the dead through him and in him? Will I be so captured by an impossible to believe story that if you press me on it, I'm going to say, I got no clue as to how that could happen. I can't even prove that it happens. But you know what? As ridiculous as this seems, it somehow has captured my imagination. And I feel drawn to trying to live in a similar ridiculous manner. Like loving my neighbors when lots of people aren't. That somehow seems worthwhile, even if I can't convince anyone else to love their neighbor. It still seems like it's the right thing that I need to do. And I can't shake it. I can't get rid of it. So the question is not whether Jesus was raised, but will I be raised? And in some ways, I get to decide whether Christ is risen. Is he risen in me? Is the tomb in me empty? Or am I still in a tomb? A tomb of cynicism, despair, pointlessness? Or is somehow there a life that shines forth as light in me, giving me something to live for? So that's my thoughts for this Easter morning. In some ways, I hope I've discouraged you from believing easily in the resurrection. I would not try and prove it to you. I would rather that we say it's completely unbelievable, and yet that's how I live. Yeah. May God help us to find that life in him.